Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for your support. Thank you for rating and reviewing this on iTunes. Thank you for going to patreon.com/Matt Lewis and supporting long-form conversation. Happy to welcome back our guest today. It's Dreher. He's the author of Live Not by Lies. He's also a senior editor at the American Conservative, and I wanted to talk with him about his recent column. It's titled, Donald Trump is Not the Messiah. That may come as a surprise to some of our listeners, but hopefully not most. Dreher, welcome back to the news.
Good to be here, Matt.
Great to talk with you. I have to confess, I mean, as someone who is I don't really call myself a Christian conservative, but I'm a Christian and I used to be a conservative. I think I still am. I've noticed this too. You were on my show recently, this podcast, a while, fairly recently, talking about your book, and we just touched on it briefly, but back then, this is before the election, I think I mentioned that there was a sense that Donald Trump, that there was something spiritual or divine taking place with Trump. People thought that, his supporters, and I said that if Trump managed to win re-election, it would really confirm that. Well, it didn't even take winning. You write, quote, the stolen election narrative is becoming a new religious phenomenon. Talk about that.
It's been remarkable and incredibly dismaying to see what has happened to a certain segment of Christian conservatives since Trump lost. And before I say anything, I should let your listeners know I'm a political conservative. I'm a religious conservative. But I tried really hard not to conflate my religious belief with nationalism. But that's not been the case with a lot of my friends and allies in the Christian conservative movement. A lot of them have taken on defending Donald Trump and the Trump presidency as a sacred cause, as a crusade. I noticed just this week something called the Jericho March has been scheduled for next week in Washington and in other cities too, but there's a big one in Washington in which Christians, not just evangelicals, but Catholics and Orthodox, even have a Catholic bishop signed up, are coming together to protest against this attempt to, what they regard as attempt to steal the election. Some of the rhetoric has been calling it satanic. And by calling it the Jericho March, they're referring to a well-known story from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Joshua, in which the Israelites marched around the walled city of Jericho 6 times, blew their trumpet, then the walls fell, they took the city. Well, these Christians are saying that that's what's happening now, that they want God to intervene to keep Trump in the White House, and I just think it's the most bizarre thing. I'm not excited about Joe Biden being president. I didn't vote for him, and I think he's going to be bad for conservatives and bad for Christians in some important ways. But this election was not stolen, and it's incredible how this whole thing has become a litmus test of religious purity. When I try to talk to friends of mine, Christian friends of mine, about the election, it's as if that they think of me as a heretic, and this is about politics.
Yeah. It's interesting too. I mean, you mentioned the Jericho project, the Jericho March. If you watch that video, they are tapping into, not just overtly, like obviously they're tapping into the story of Jericho, but the shibboleths as well, the rhetoric, just the way that they talk is really borrowing and then like weaponizing the way that Christians my whole life in the church that I've been around have spoken. And let me give you an example. You quote from a blog that says, quote, "I hope and pray that Trump can rise to this moment, and that not only is God not done using him as a cudgel of divine punishment against the wicked powers of the world, but has in fact preserved and prepared him for precisely this opportunity." You know, that's the kind of thing that used to be said of, maybe like a missionary or something going into the field, but now people are using it to talk about Donald Trump. And I mean, as you write, like, this is just a political, Donald Trump is just a political candidate who's a flawed candidate who lost an election and a global pandemic that he didn't handle very well. Like, how is that the same thing as like something to get outraged about, like the imposition of tyranny?
Matt, I think back to my youth growing up in the late 70s and 1980s, how you could turn on television and see people like the late Jack Van Impe, these TV preachers, evangelical preachers, talking about the end of the world. And they would read the headlines of the newspaper and say, see, this shows that we are in the end times. And as a young teenager, I got scared to death with that stuff. And it was kind of, in a weird way, like porn, in that it was like apocalypse porn, right? I would listen to it and like, what if they're right? What if they're right? What if the rapture's going to happen by the end of this week? And eventually I grew out of that. But I think a lot of that is happening right now with Trump, in the sense that people want to feel that we are living in very vivid and eschatological times, right? I mean, we are living in vivid times and eventful times. There's no doubt about it. But I think that there's something within a lot of Christians that insist that this must be the end. This must be some, Wagnerian clash of the gods, because it makes them feel more significant. I mean, I don't know. That's that's my armchair psychological theory. But what worries me so much, Matt, is not so much for our politics, but for the church, because we Christians cannot hold our young adults in the church. And if you look at the statistics, if you look at the studies from Pew and others, the abandonment of organized religion by millennials, and especially by Generation Z, it's epic. It's happening at a rate that we've never seen in American history. And I fear that this sort of thing is going to accelerate that Christians who think they're defending the church and defending all things godly by politicizing the
Yeah.
church so much are going to end up making the church look ridiculous and like a threat.
And a church cannot be made to look ridiculous. What's the line from The Godfather? I'm sure I butchered that quote from The Godfather, but a man in my position. But no, but seriously, I think you make a really valid point, right? So like, when I was a kid, not even a kid, but like when I was a young person, I remember, look, yeah, there's some fringe people in the Republican Party, but man, we've got people like Rudy Giuliani, who is the mayor of America, who, just a serious person. And we've got Newt Gingrich, who's like obviously this intellectual, super smart guy. And these people have by and large like beclowned themselves. And so then you start to think, well, maybe I was wrong about other stuff too, right? And I feel like Trump started with the conservative movement and kind of undermining that. And now I'm like looking, I was like, what else was I wrong about? Like, if I was fooled by Newt and Rudy, like, was it like, if Reagan was still alive, would he be like singing in Vegas right now and like selling, reverse mortgages? I don't, like, and then you start to think, now Trump has gotten to Christianity too. Like, I feel like that's happened. And we see it with like Michelle Bachmann's prayer on video, and, people like Kenneth Copeland and people like Jerry Falwell Jr. And at some point it's like, well, maybe all this is bullshit,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
if these people are.
Well, there's this guy. He's become a real insistent and screechy voice right now in the Christian right. John Zmirak. He writes at thestream.org, and he's a frequent guest on the Eric Metaxas show. Zmirak wrote something recently calling me and other Christians who are failing to sign on to the Stop the Steal campaign, calling us, quote, servile, and comparing us to Nazi collaborators. I mean, it's just outrageous, this stuff. And I knew Zmirak actually back when I was in college in the 80s. He was a graduate student at LSU in Baton Rouge, where I was an undergraduate. And this guy was really funny. He would go around campus, he made the right enemies. He was always tweaking the people in the English, in his grad school program in the English department. but I never met anybody or never seen anybody who seemed to thrive so much on the dark energy of being hated. And
Hmm.
now, 40 years later, 30, 40 years later, we see him, and he's become this person who is standing up, accusing Christians of being Nazi collaborators if they don't go along with Trump. And somebody like Eric Metaxas, who's an old friend, one of the sweetest, dearest, most sincere men you could ever hope to meet, he's had Zmirak on his show amplifying this craziness. And Eric even said that he was prepared to die, give his life for the cause of keeping Donald Trump in the White House. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah. No, I wrote my book, Too Dumb to Fail, in 2016, and I'm very proud of it. I think it was very prophetic. But one of the only things that I'm really regretting is my editor wanted me to do a chapter where I sort of talked about things that how things can go right and who some of the leading voices are that I think we should be listening to. And I cited Eric Metaxas as somebody that I really respected and somebody that I thought would be a voice for not even he wasn't even political that much back then, but just like conservative, you know, leadership, for lack of a better word. And I'm so disappointed. But it's not just Eric Metaxas, talking about, being willing to die for Donald Trump. It's also like the Arizona Republican Party had a tweet or a retweet, like asking, like, are you willing to die? Are you willing to
Yeah.
die for this cause? Um, I don't get it. We've seen other politicians like George W. Bush was surely a more devout Christian than Donald Trump. And, a lot of us voted for George W. Bush, but I don't remember talk about being willing to die for him.
No, that this is something that I confess has really caught me by surprise. And I'm somebody who thinks I don't blame Trump for ruining our politics. I think Trump is a symptom of a decadence that had set in long before Donald Trump came down that escalator. He has accelerated some really bad trends in American politics, but it's not totally his fault. But what I did not see coming, Matt, is that this sort of fanatical devotion to Trump the person, to a cult of personality. And to be honest, I've just written this book, Live Not by Lies, in which in part, I talk about how Hannah Arendt in the 1950s identified certain aspects of German society and Russian society that made the way for accepting totalitarianism. And one of the things she said was a sign of a pre-totalitarian society was the willingness of people to give up caring about the truth, to accept things that satisfied them emotionally, even if they were ridiculous. Now, in my book, I talk about how this has happened on the left, but look, it's happening now on the right. I was having beers with a couple of prominent conservative lawyers in my city last week, and they're both are Republicans, one of whom I know for sure voted for Trump. And they were both saying that if you look at the legal filings by Trump's legal team and you read them and you compare that to what Trump team is saying in public, there's just this chasm between them. The legal filings are completely absurd. But most ordinary people don't know this. I'm not a lawyer. If you're not a lawyer, you can't see this thing. And so it's easy to believe what Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and the others are saying on TV. But for me, I think the key point is that people don't care. They really don't care. People on the right, all they want is to be reaffirmed in their belief that Trump is a sacred victim.
Yeah. I guess what concerns me is, some of the people on the right just are going along with Trump because he's their team and maybe they don't know any better. But, just like you wrote this book, Live Not by Lies, where you interviewed, people who were like dissidents in the Soviet Union. And your book is mostly a critique of the left and warning about the soft totalitarianism of the left coming to America, but you have also applied some of those findings to your critique of Trump, right? And against authoritarianism in general, whether that be on the right or the left. Someone like Eric Metaxas is a highly intelligent, uh, guy who wrote a book about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You know what I'm saying? Like, how is it that Eric Metaxas doesn't see this and is doing this? It really concerns me. I don't think he can plead ignorance.
No, no. I mean, I've had similar conversations with my mom about Trump in this election, and she is 100% on board with Eric's side. But my mom is a little old lady with a high school education who lives in rural Louisiana. Eric is a Yale educated Manhattanite. And again, I can't emphasize strongly enough to your listeners what a good guy Eric is. I've known him for so long, and loyal, sweet, kind, will do anything for you. But I think that if I try to understand why things have happened with Eric the way they have, I can remember theological conversations we would have when we were walking around Manhattan back in 98, 99, when we first got to be friends. Eric is an evangelical, and but I would ask him about why he came to certain conclusions about church life, about God, and so forth. And he would lean heavily on the idea that God told him this. Well, God told me. I was praying, and God said this. And I was a Catholic back then. I've never been an evangelical. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian now. And I would just ask him, well, how do you know that was the voice of God? And for Eric, that was a meaningless question. I mean, he was genuinely convinced that this is what God was saying to him. And this is something that I've really struggled with as someone who is outside the evangelical circles, how quick so many of evangelicals are to believe that they are being led by the voice of God, when in fact, in the Catholic tradition, and certainly in the Orthodox tradition, the first instinct we would do when we feel like we're being told something by God is to doubt it and go speak to a priest or some wise spiritual elder and test that voice.
Yeah.
But
I think that's I mean, I am an evangelical, and I think that that's just what you're describing is actually biblical, is to discern and test the spirits, and that's just responsible and prudent. And I have to tell you, I mean, as an evangelical, I think this hits me maybe even harder than it hits you, because it's not just the same religion, like writ large, but the exact, I mentioned the shibboleths, the way that they speak. And there's certain ways that you hear growing up in church, like evangelicals, when they pray, they always say, just, if you would just, Father, if you would just, a lot of justs in there.
Father God, we
And
just want to.
yeah. And like, that's just an example for people who may not understand what I mean when I'm talking about the way that they talk. And, and I've defended like even the prosperity gospel, like I wrote a piece for The Week where I talked about like, I'm against, consumerism and commercialism. And I'm against sort of like the cheap grace and all that. And I do believe that part of being a follower or a disciple suffering is part of that. But if you read the Bible, there is a prosperity gospel. I mean, there really is. I mean, there are tons of verses about God's people prospering and even the Abrahamic covenant. And so there are things, and I'm seeing people saying the kinds of things that I grew up listening to, and they're using it to support a coup against against democracy. And it makes me, it's starting to make me, I'm not going to question my faith, because that trends, I mean, that transcends all this stuff. But it does make me wonder about some of the people that I've sat in pews next to.
Oh, I know, Matt. And, I'm somebody who is used to defending not only Christians, but evangelicals in particular, because I think that they are far too often maligned and mocked and spoken of quite unjustly in mainstream media discourse. But this is a kind of thing that is just impossible to defend. And look, it's not just evangelicals. The thing you quoted from earlier, that passage, appeared on the blog of a popular Orthodox Christian layman, a guy from my own church. And there is a well-respected Orthodox priest, conservative Orthodox priest, who is signed up to go to the Jericho March. And
This is the part you're referencing is about how God has prepared Donald Trump for precisely this opportunity.
yeah, and they talk
You know,
about how they hope that this person who quoted this, wrote this quote, said that they hope that you know Donald Trump is prepared to be an American Caesar to arrest the plotters against him, and I mean it's crazy stuff. It's like a soap opera, but the fact that there are Christians who believe this, who want to see a coup against democracy, if and an overthrow of the constitutional order if Donald Trump can't be returned to the White House, it's chilling. And this is the kind of
yeah.
thing that is going to give people on the left who hate us, who think Christians are a threat to all that is good and holy anyway, it will validate those suspicions. And I believe will accelerate the persecution that I believe was coming anyway. But my gosh, when you have prominent Christians who are being openly seditious like this, we have crossed a very important line. If we're talking about American Caesar, we've crossed a Rubicon.
Hmm. Do you think that this attraction to Trump, I see a couple of options. One, it could be almost like a false prophet type thing where he is tapping into some demagogic things, and this is a cult type situation. The other option is just the enemy of the enemy is my friend, right? That they have convinced themselves that we are living in this apocalyptic time, and therefore Trump just happens to be at the right place at the right time, or maybe it's a combination of those things. What do you think?
Well, I was talking last night or emailing with a friend of mine who's a very intelligent, very highly educated evangelical, and he said, listen, maybe it's the case that the Jericho March people believe that the things that made America America were abandoned long ago, and there's nothing left to defend at all. And that's why they're giving themselves over to believing that in the Jericho March and believing Trump is the American Caesar. And I think that there's something to that. There is a something to it in the sense, Matt, that uh, people, if you're a conservative Christian, if you believe in the sort of things that we were all raised to believe in civics class about America, you see that all deeply under threat. You've lived through a year in which you've seen not just Confederate statues overthrown, but statues of the founders destroyed, mocked. I mean, we are living through revolutionary times, and the left really is doing all this. But it forms it provokes a sense of desperation in people that maybe they really do feel that there is nothing left to defend. But I tell you what it brings to mind. It brings to mind the Spanish Civil War. There's this fantastic documentary series that Granada Television, a British production company, did in the 1980s about the Spanish Civil War. You can see it on YouTube. Just type in Spanish Civil War Granada TV. The first episode is about the preparation for the Spanish Civil War from the years 1931 to 1935. How once democracy came to Spain, when the king abdicated and they had a republic established in 1931, the left took power, and some extremists on the left started burning down convents and churches and killing priests. At the next election, 2 years later, the right was so horrified by that that they took power and then they started paying back the left. Well, then after that, the left came back. You can see where this was going. And
Right.
they quote some man in the documentary. He had fought with the far right militia. He said, by the time 1935 got here, whenever we would see a socialist or a leftist walking down the street, we saw the devil, and they saw us the same way. The problem is people in Spain had ceased at that point to believe in democracy because democracy was a system that allowed them, the evil ones, to come to power. And this was true on both the left and the right. I think that we are in real danger of that happening in America. And right now, the pro-Trump fanatics, religious fanatics, are pushing this, but the left has been doing the same thing all summer with and they're doing it within it, not just in the streets by knocking over statues and being iconoclasts, but also within the institutions.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think I'm out of touch, because my worldview is, I don't know if you read Jonah Goldberg's latest book, but he talks about how Western civilization and America are really just a miracle, and I mean, part of it's the economic aspect, but I just think like in the fact that we just live in a place where we have the rule of law, where you're probably not going to get raped and murdered if you leave your house, like, is kind of a miracle. Like, it's a very dangerous world, and whether it's modern medicine or this, just generally speaking, civilization, it's pretty good. I can worship the way I want to worship. I can tweet pretty much whatever I want to tweet. I mean, I guess if I threatened somebody, that would be illegal, but I have freedom of speech. I can worship the way I want to worship. I'm not that people want me to wear a mask. I think I probably should. Like, I'm not up in arms about the mask.
Mhm.
Like, from my perspective, and again, maybe I'm trying to just see things optimistically. Like, I feel really blessed and grateful for what we have, and I'm really about conserving what we have, this miraculous, special thing that we have. But I'm one of the rare people, apparently. Like, other even conservatives don't really think. Didn't I think Dinesh D'Souza had a book once upon a time called "What's So Great About America"? Like, I feel like conservatives need to read that now, because like apparently they don't really think America's that good anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, and I'm divided over this too because I see that so much of our, in my point of view, from my point of view, so much of our liberty has turned into license, and I do think the country is becoming decadent in some pretty serious ways. That said, you're exactly right, Matt. That what we have in this country was, it didn't come about overnight. It came about through a lot of blood and struggle and suffering. It took that to build liberal democracy in the West. And I don't think we should give it up so easily, even if it means the people who we don't like and we don't trust are coming to power, because what is the alternative? Human history, if you know anything about history, you know how fragile civilization is. The veneer is very thin. And it's so dismaying to me to see, as you've just pointed out, to see conservatives of all people embracing this kind of radicalism, because it is so unconservative. You know, I, and if you say that, you get accused by some of people on our side of being a David French type, a cuck, I think, so on and so forth. And I happen to like David French, but it's amazing how the sort of things that used to be mainstream conservative thought just a day and a half ago, it seems, are now things that are considered on the right to be insults.
Yeah, and one of the really great points you make in this piece is that some of the people who are like really up in arms about the decadence of our society themselves are like not very devout. And you write, a pastor once told me that most of the people in his conservative church were all wound up about what the liberals were doing to disrupt America, and they were right, but they had no interest in thinking about their own total immersion in consumer culture and the ways of suburban America were undermining their own Christian discipleship and malforming their children. The threats were always out there, never internal. The answer was always vote Republican, consume the correct media, social media, and to sort one's own opinions to absolve oneself from doing anything meaningful. That sounds about right to me.
Yeah, yeah, I completely believe that. I think about, Matt, back when I lived in New York City. I was there from '98 to 2003, and I was a very fervent Catholic back then, a conservative Catholic. And I remember once we had a dinner at our apartment in Brooklyn, and where we got together some of our conservative Catholic friends, and we men, it was always the men, were just started complaining about the church, about how bad the bishops were, about how crummy the catechism was, and so on and so forth. We had a guy there in our at dinner that night, a Catholic priest, and he was a very conservative guy. He said, "Guys, the things you're saying are all true, 100%. But here's the thing, you have so many opportunities to do better by your children than my parents had to do by us when I was growing up in the '70s. You could go on Amazon and have a library sent to you that Aquinas could only have dreamed of in just a week. You can network on the internet, find other young Catholics who are having kids who care about this stuff, and get on and on and on he went. And he said, yeah, things are as bad as you think they are, but you could do something about it. And I remember listening to him, Matt, and thinking, he's really right about this. But then I went right back to bitching about the bishops. And I don't think that I lifted a finger to do anything positive. I thought the problem was just other people needed to get their acts together and then we would be sorted. And I see that attitude all the time. It's lazy, it's performative, it's emotional. But this is how we are.
I agree. And I wonder, just going back to the headline here, and everyone should go read this piece. It's called Donald Trump is Not the Messiah at the American Conservative. I'm just wondering, like, was it a lack of civics? Is it, has the right always had much more of a authoritarian strand than I thought? Or maybe your premise is right that some Christians feel like they've already lost the country, so it doesn't matter if it's already gone. They might as well have a friendly authoritarian to an unfriendly one. But yeah, I'm just wrestling with what this all means, because I'll tell you what, this headline, Donald Trump is not the Messiah, is not a joke. Like, this needs to be said. Like, the
No.
fact that you needed to say this is indicative of a problem, right?
Well, it's a false religion. I mean, this is what Nazism, this is what communism were in the 20th century. They were false religions. They were not just political ideologies. They were total systems that promised you a sense of restoring harmony and justice to the world, and so on and so forth. I didn't see Donald Trump as being that sort of person because there's nothing systemic about Donald Trump. But and I've not really understood all the passion for MAGA. I completely understand voting for Trump as a lesser of two evils. A lot of my friends did that too, and I don't even blame them for that. But thinking that Trump is this sort of paladin, this white knight, this sort of Christian king who's going to rise in and save civilization, I mean, it is so seriously diluted that it makes me wonder if there's something spiritual going on. And I'm saying this as a Christian, as a believing Christian, there's some sort of demonic deception
Yeah.
afoot.
That's what I was getting at a little bit earlier. I try not to go too spiritual on this podcast, because it's a political podcast, but people have a certain magnetism, and it sort of defies logic, and like I've heard Napoleon, Andrew Roberts, who's this great historian of Churchill and Napoleon and others, has talked about how Napoleon said, when he was like talking about a general, he would say, like, is he lucky? Is he lucky? There's stuff out there that defies logic that we just don't really fully understand. And the appeal that a politician has to people, a charisma that defies logic, it makes me wonder if there's something supernatural at play when that happens.
Well, and I just want to caution, or
like, is it just like a demagogic techniques that you could, like Hitler 101 or Mussolini, like how to be a dictator? Like, no, I think there's something, there's something more, call it charisma, whatever the word is, there's something more.
Well, I think it might be Triumph of the Will, Leni Riefenstahl's 1934 Nazi Party Congress film. It's an incredibly powerful piece of propaganda. There's a speech in there, I think it's Joseph Goebbels, warming up the crowd for Hitler. And he says, Hitler ist Deutschland und Deutschland Hitler ist. Hitler is Germany and Germany is Hitler. It's this identification of the nation with a person that is so dangerous. And I don't think we're there with Trump, but I do think that we're a lot closer than makes me comfortable. And again, this is coming from Christians. And my fear, Matt, is that this is where we are as a nation now. It's coming from the right in this particular moment, but I think that we are so disconnected from our traditions, from a classically liberal way of thinking about politics and civics, that if somebody charismatic came in from the left, they would go for it too. I don't know if you remember when Obama was elected, there was this crazy column by someone in San Francisco calling him a light worker. and we all laughed at that. But now I think that if a charismatic figure from the left came in, that we would easily see a number of people from the left behaving just as these Christians are towards Trump.
Yeah, certainly some. I don't know if it's enough to take over, but yeah, once the genie's out of the bottle, right? It's it's scary, and this just reminds me, and maybe we'll end on this because this is like the lowest, cheapest form of political punditry, but if Obama did it, Rod, let me ask you, if Obama did what Trump is doing now, like he lost the election, but he behaved the same way Trump is now, trying to overturn the election, what would we be saying? What would we be doing? You and me. Like, now I'm not talking about the right. Like, what would you and me be? I think we'd be in the streets probably at this point.
Well, I'm afraid your audio cut out there for a second, Matt, but I think I heard. I think I know where you're going with this.
You know where I'm going, right?
Yeah, maybe the deep state has interfered. I mean, I think that every single conservative pundit and establishment figure would spontaneously combust if Obama did this. But this is just par for the course, and you can't even see Republicans in Congress standing up and saying, "Wait a minute, this is wrong. This is wrong." It's just breathtaking because they are more afraid of Donald Trump, the person, than they fear Trump more than they love America. That's it right there. And they fear Trump more than they love our Constitution. And look, again, I'm not glad that Joe Biden is going to be the next president, but I'll tell you this, the way Trump and his most ardent followers have behaved since the election makes me realize that we, alas, had the correct election result, even though I didn't contribute to it.
Yes. When they talk about the lesser of two evils, they never tell you that Biden probably is the lesser of two evils. So yeah, it's usually people saying the lesser of two evils are encouraging you to vote for Trump, right?
Yeah. Well, I've got to say too, and we can end on this. I want to make it clear that my great concern is less for America, because America is a creation of human beings. It's a good place. It's a great place. It's my home. I hope it lasts forever, but it won't. All empires must fall. But I'm concerned more about the church, meaning the body of Christ, Christians, and the Christian faith. As I said earlier, if you look at the statistics, we Christians are not holding on to our adult children. If young people come to think that to be a Christian means to give oneself over to idol worship of a political figure or a political cause, whether it's on the left or the right, then Christianity will be discredited. I think that is absolutely what's happening now. My son is in college now. He's an Orthodox Christian too, and he's tried to tell me, he said, "Dad, you have no idea how much damage this is doing to conservatism in my generation and to the church."
I think you're right. It's scary. We'll end it there, man, on that very dark note. Everybody, go get the book, Live Not by Lies, and read this column at the American Conservative. It's called Donald Trump is Not the Messiah. Rod Dreher, thank you for coming back on the news.
Hey, Matt, it's always great to be with you.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.